He got a piece of rock in the middle of the sea, and everyone laughed. But when the fisherman went under the house, he found something that made the whole town go quiet. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The wind that came off the bay carried the sharp smell of salt and iron, the kind that stuck to nets, ropes, and the bones of men who had lived too long by the sea. In the town of Grey Haven, that smell never left. It mixed with the sour smell of diesel and the faint smell of fish scales that covered the docks like dust. The men who worked there measured life not in years, but in seasons of catch and loss. Among them was Peter Hayden, a man who had once been strong enough to fight both sea and fate, and now simply put up with both. He was 40, maybe 41. He had stopped counting after his wife left, and the boy was buried. His boat, the Maran, was the oldest in the harbor. Its paint was blistered and hull-scarred from decades of weather. His hands were a map of cuts and calluses, his face the color of driftwood, with eyes faded by salt and grief. Every morning, he pushed out to sea before dawn alone and returned after sunset with barely enough fish to pay for fuel. The other fishermen called him Saint Peter, not for any holiness, but because, like the saint, he seemed doomed to cast his nets forever without reward. When the letter came, it arrived in a plain envelope, the kind used for unpaid bills or bad news. The seal on the back was stamped with the mark of a law office in Portland, something no one in Grey Haven ever got, unless they were being sued or someone had died. Peter broke it open with a knife. Inside was a single sheet thick as parchment printed with careful legal words that took him several reads to understand. It announced the passing of Captain Arthur Hayden, retired seafarer, and informed Peter that his presence was required for the reading of the will. Arthur Hayden was a name buried deep in the town's memory. Some said he had once captained a fleet trawler that vanished during a storm decades ago. Others remembered him as a loner who built a house on a rock somewhere far off the coast and never came back to shore. To Peter, he was little more than a family rumor. His father's uncle, maybe his grandfather's cousin, a man mentioned only at Christmas dinners long past. The news stirred no emotion except a faint curiosity. He had nothing to lose and nowhere else to be. The reading took place 3 days later in a cramped office that smelled of old paper and lemon polish. There were only 4 people in the room. The lawyer, 2 distant relatives dressed like vultures in black coats, and Peter in his weather-faded jacket and sea boots that still smelled faintly of fish. The lawyer cleared his throat, his spectacles glinting in the dull light, and began to read from a stack of documents. To the 2 well-dressed cousins went modest savings accounts, an antique clock, and the contents of a safety deposit box. They nodded solemnly, already thinking of how to divide the money. Then came Peter's turn. To Mr. Peter Hayden, the lawyer read, "I leave my home and property known as Skull's Rock, situated 20 miles off the coast of Grey Haven, including the house, the dock, and all structures upon it." The room fell silent for a heartbeat. Then one of the cousins let out a laugh. "A rock? You're giving him a rock?" The other chuckled too, whispering something about fitting for a fisherman. Even the lawyer's mouth twitched as he continued reading the rest of the will maintenance clauses. Debt settled, the usual details, but Peter barely heard him. He sat quietly, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the window where a strip of sea shone like dull metal beneath the overcast sky. When the session ended, one of the cousins clapped him on the shoulder with a smirk. "Congratulations, cousin. You're now the proud owner of a whetstone and a shack full of gulls." Peter simply nodded and walked out into the drizzle. The laughter followed him down the narrow street until the sound was swallowed by the wind. Back at the docks, the men had already heard. Word traveled fast in Grey Haven, faster than any tide. As Peter fueled his boat, someone called from the bar porch, "Hey, Pete, how's the new estate? You going to build a palace for lobsters out there?" The group erupted in laughter. Another shouted, "Make sure to invite us when you throw the grand opening." He said nothing, just kept filling the tank. The hiss of fuel his only answer. Inside, something old and stubborn stirred a feeling he hadn't known in years. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the folded map the lawyer had given him. It was simple, hand-drawn, showing a jagged speck labeled Skull's Rock. 20 miles east of Grey Haven, beyond the shipping lanes, surrounded by cold currents and nothingness. In the corner of the map, in the old man's shaky handwriting, was a single note. "For the one who still listens to the sea." He poured himself a measure of cheap whiskey, studied the words again, and decided he would go. Not for money, there would be none, but for the same reason men climb mountains or chase storms, to face something that cannot laugh back. He spent the next 2 days preparing the Maran, patching leaks, checking the small diesel engine, stocking supplies. The other fishermen watched and joked, but when they saw he was serious, their laughter turned uneasy. On the third morning, before dawn, Peter untied the ropes. The harbor lights flickered behind him, reflections trembling in the dark water. The sea was calm, gray as steel. He pushed the throttle, and the old engine coughed awake, belching smoke. The Maran crept out between the buoys, past the last markers of safety. Behind him, the shore shrank to a thin black line. Ahead, the horizon was a pale bruise of light. For the first few hours, he followed the compass, then switched to the stars when the sun broke through clouds. The waves were long and low, the kind that rolled without sound. Occasionally, a gull followed him, circling once or twice before losing interest. He thought about the letter, about Arthur Hayden living alone on a rock. What kind of man chooses exile when he could have land, company, and warmth? Maybe the same kind of man who keeps going to sea when everyone tells him to stop. By mid-afternoon, a fog settled in, thick and pale, muffling every sound. Peter cut the engine and listened. He could hear the slow breathing of the ocean, the sigh of water against wood, the distant crack of waves against unseen cliffs. Then, through the mist, a shape began to emerge. A vertical mass of darkness rising straight from the water like the back of some ancient creature. As he drew closer, the outline sharpened into the rough face of stone, streaked white with salt and bird droppings. At its peak stood a small house, square and solitary, its roof a dull patch of rust-red tiles. He felt the engine shudder beneath him as he maneuvered around the base of the rock, searching for a landing. On the southern side, he found a natural inlet, barely wide enough for the boat. The water there was calmer, sheltered from the open sea. A narrow stairway carved directly into the stone led upward. He tied the rope to an iron ring fixed in the rock and tested the first step. It was slippery but solid. Halfway up, he stopped to catch his breath and looked around. The world was nothing but water and sky, both the same shade of gray. The air smelled pure, untouched by smoke or rot. For the first time in years, the silence around him wasn't empty. It was whole. When he reached the top, the house loomed before him, built of the same granite as the island itself. The windows were shuttered, the door weathered, but unbroken. He hesitated a moment, then pushed it open. The hinges groaned softly, and a gust of cold, dry air brushed his face. Inside was a single large room, sparsely furnished. A wooden table, a narrow bed, shelves lined with old nautical books, a stove in the corner. Everything was clean, dustless, as if waiting. He walked slowly, touching the objects. On the table lay a rusted compass, a barometer, and a small notebook filled with numbers and tide marks. Against the far wall hung a framed photograph, a younger Arthur Hayden standing beside a ship, smiling faintly, the sea glittering behind him. There was a steadiness in the man's eyes that Peter recognized, the calm of someone who had made peace with solitude. He found a set of keys on a hook by the window, each labeled with a thin brass tag. Door, fuel shed, dock. The last one made him pause. A dock. There was no dock visible anywhere on the island. He pocketed the keys and stepped back outside. The sky had turned pale gold, the sun sinking behind the fog. He walked around the house, his boots crunching on gravel. On the far side, near the edge of the cliff, he spotted a small wooden structure, a shed locked tight with chain and padlock. The tag on the key in his pocket seemed to hum against his leg. But the light was fading and the tide rising. The climb back to the boat in darkness would be dangerous. He decided to wait until morning. That night, he lit a lantern, ate cold beans from a tin, and sat by the window. The sea was invisible, but he could hear it moving, slow and constant, a living thing breathing in the dark. The sound filled the empty house until it felt almost alive. He thought of the laughter in Grey Haven, of the sneers and the pity. Out here, there was no one to laugh, no one to remind him of what he wasn't. There was only the sea, the house, and the question of why a man would choose to die here. Somewhere after midnight, as the wind picked up, he felt a faint vibration under the floor. a deep, resonant thud that seemed to come from inside the rock itself. It happened again, rhythmic, like a heartbeat or the echo of waves striking some hidden hollow. He held the lantern close to the boards, listening. The sound faded, replaced by the low murmur of the surf. Maybe it was just the sea playing tricks. Maybe the stone wasn't as solid as it looked. He leaned back, the lantern flickering, shadows stretching across the walls. Tomorrow he would check the shed, see what his uncle had locked away. For now, he let the noise of the storm lull him, the wind moaning around the house like a voice half-remembered. Outside, the fog thickened until the island vanished completely from sight, leaving only the faint glow of a single window, flickering in the dark ocean like a distant signal to no one. When dawn finally came, it rose out of a wall of fog, dim and shapeless, turning the air a pale gray that blended sea and sky into one endless horizon. Peter woke to the smell of salt and damp stone. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the steady hiss of the surf below. He dressed slowly, his joints stiff from the cold, and stepped outside. The wind had shifted overnight. It was softer now, carrying the cry of gulls and the clean scent of open water. For the first time since he had set foot on the island, the place felt less hostile and more like something alive. The house looked different in daylight. What had seemed like a ruin in the dark now revealed itself as a fortress built with care and skill. The granite blocks were tightly fitted, the roof layered with thick slate, and the windows framed in weathered oak. Whoever had built it had known what the sea could do, and had built not against it, but with it. Moss grew in the cracks of the steps, and the iron railing was streaked with rust. But nothing about the structure felt abandoned. It was old, but it endured. Peter took a slow walk around the house. The back opened toward a steep drop where the cliffs plunged straight into the foaming water. From there, the horizon stretched unbroken. No ships, no buoys, no land. Just the endless shifting gray of the Atlantic. Near the edge stood the wooden shed he had noticed the night before. Its door chain shut. The padlock was large, crusted with salt. He touched it lightly and felt it tremble faintly under his fingers, as if the wood behind it were breathing with the sea. He turned back toward the house. Inside, the air was dry and faintly metallic, the smell of salt meeting iron. He lit the small kerosene lamp that sat on the table, and the flame cast warm circles of light over the walls. The room was larger than it had appeared by lamplight the previous evening. There were two doors in the back, one leading to a narrow bedroom, the other to a small storeroom that still held canned goods and a rusted kettle. Everything was arranged neatly, as if the owner had expected to return. The bed was stripped, but folded linens waited on a shelf. There was a comfort in that simple order, the kind that came from long discipline. He made tea with water from a rain barrel, sitting by the window as the fog began to thin. From there, he could see the mainland faintly in the distance, a thin blue line beneath the rising sun. It looked impossibly far away. He wondered if Arthur Hayden had ever missed it, or if the silence had become his only company. The old man's presence lingered in every corner. On the walls hung charts of the coastal currents and tide tables dating back decades. The handwriting was meticulous. The ink faded but steady. There were notes in the margins, adjustments to depth, records of storms, even personal remarks. Short curt sentences like strong winds from the east, roof held, and gulls nesting again near the north wall. It was not the diary of a recluse, but the log of a man maintaining a post. On a small shelf above the desk, Peter found a cigar box filled with trinkets, a broken pocket watch, a piece of coral, a brass button from an old uniform. Beneath it, folded carefully in wax paper, lay a photograph of a much younger Arthur standing beside a ship. The same smile as in the framed portrait on the wall. In the background of the photo, the vessel's name was visible in faded letters. Margaret, too. Peter stared at it for a long time, trying to recall where he had heard that name. Somewhere in the back of his memory, from old tavern talk and fisherman stories, it stirred a ship that had vanished in a storm years ago, taking with it an entire crew and a valuable cargo. He remembered the rumors, insurance fraud, ghost stories, sightings of a drifting hull. He had been a child when it happened, too young to understand the details. He closed the box and turned his attention to the keys hanging by the window. Each was tagged in brass. The one marked dock caught his eye again. He had seen no dock, no pier, not even a place where one could have stood. Yet his uncle's meticulous nature would not have labeled it without reason. He pocketed the key, intending to investigate later. By midday, the fog had lifted, revealing the full shape of the island. From the roof, he could see that it was indeed no more than a rock, bare, jagged, and roughly oval, rising steeply from the sea. But there was beauty in its isolation. The gleam of wet stone, the pale green of moss, the white arcs of foam that traced its edges. The only sound was the rhythmic crash of waves far below, like the slow breathing of some ancient creature. As he climbed down from the roof, he noticed a small trail leading around the southern edge, half hidden by wild grass. Following it, he reached the base of the cliff where the rock curved inward. The trail ended at a narrow ledge overlooking the water. It wasn't a dock in any sense, just a natural shelf where the sea lapped quietly, sheltered from the wind. He crouched there, running his hand over the rock. There were faint scratches on the surface, grooves worn into the stone as if by ropes or chains. Once long ago, something had been tied there. He returned to the house, uneasy but intrigued. The afternoon passed in quiet work. He cleaned the hearth, swept the floor, repaired a window shutter that banged in the wind. The repetition soothed him. Every sound was amplified. The scrape of the broom, the creak of boards, the distant gulls. Without meaning to, he found himself humming a low tune from years ago that he hadn't thought of since his son's funeral. The echo of his voice against the stone wall startled him, as though another man were humming along. By evening, the sea was calm again, a mirror of silver light beneath the setting sun. He lit the lamp, warmed a can of soup over the small stove, and ate slowly, savoring the heat. The house no longer felt empty. It felt watchful, as if the stones themselves approved of his presence. He took the old captain's log to the table and opened it at random. The entries were simple, but vivid notes of weather, maintenance, and solitude. One line in particular made him pause. The sea keeps what it loves. Sometimes it gives it back. He read it twice, unsure if it was wisdom or warning. Outside, the gulls had gone silent. The only sound was the slow, deliberate roll of the tide. He remembered the shed and the heavy lock that waited there, but fatigue pressed down on him like a weight. The day had been long, and the isolation, though peaceful, gnawed at his nerves. He decided to wait until morning to see what secrets the old man had kept behind that chain. He extinguished the lamp and laid down on the narrow bed. The darkness was absolute, the kind found only far from human lights. He could hear the sea moving under the rock, deep and steady, as if the island itself had a heartbeat. He tried to sleep, but his thoughts drifted like the tide of the laughter back in Grey Haven, of the cousins and their smug smiles, of the mystery of the dock that wasn't there. At some point near dawn, he woke to a faint metallic rattle. For a moment, he thought it was the window shutter again, but then he realized it came from outside. The wind had risen, carrying the hollow clang of metal against wood. He rose, pulled on his jacket, and stepped into the cold. The sound led him to the edge of the cliff where the shed stood. The chain on the door trembled slightly in the gusts, tapping against the padlock like a heartbeat. The wood around it creaked as though something inside had shifted in his sleep. He stood there for a long time, the first light of morning spilling over the horizon. The sea stretched endless before him, and for the first time he felt that the island was not empty, but waiting for him to ask the right question. He turned back toward the house, the brass key cold in his hand, and knew that when the sun rose higher, he would use it. The wind caught the edge of the lock one last time, making it sing against the door, a dull ringing note that seemed to come not from the shed, but from deep within the rock below. The sun climbed slowly above the horizon, turning the gray sea into a sheet of gold. The night wind had left the air crisp, and the sound of the waves against the cliffs was steady and low, like the deep breathing of some ancient creature that lived beneath the island. Peter stood at the edge of the cliff, watching the water churn and glint far below. The brass key in his pocket felt heavy, colder than the air. He could not shake the sense that the island was watching him, that it had been waiting for him to act. After breakfast, he walked back to the shed. The morning light revealed details he hadn't noticed before. The salt stains on the door, the rust marks around the chain, the faint outlines of numbers scratched into the wood as if by a knife, coordinates perhaps, or just the idle etchings of a man who had lived too long in silence. He brushed away some of the grime, slipped the key into the lock, and turned it. The metal resisted for a moment, then gave with a dull snap that echoed in the quiet air. The chain fell loose, rattling softly against the wood. When he pushed the door open, a cold gust of air came out, dry and old. Inside, the shed was dim and narrow. Dust floated in the light like drifting snow. Old tools hung neatly on the walls. Hammers, saws, coils of rope, and several metal hooks whose purpose he couldn't guess. The place smelled faintly of oil and salt. On the floor stood a heavy wooden winch bolted to the stone beneath. The rope wound around it disappeared through a square opening covered by planks. He knelt, pried the planks loose one by one, and found a circular hatch set into the rock. Its metal was blackened with age, but still solid, sealed with an iron ring. Peter hesitated. The air rising through the thin seam smelled faintly of the sea, but colder, purer, untouched by weather. He gripped the ring and pulled. It took both hands and the strength of his back, but the hatch lifted with a deep groan that vibrated through the stone. Beneath it yawned a narrow shaft lined with old timbers and a ladder that descended into darkness. The air that drifted up was cool and damp. He fetched his lantern from the house, lit it, and leaned over the opening. The light reached perhaps 20 feet down before fading into shadow. He lowered himself carefully onto the first rung. The wood creaked, but held. Step by step he descended, the lantern swaying in his hand. The sound of the sea grew louder, resonating through the rock around him. The ladder ended on a ledge carved into the stone. Ahead stretched a tunnel, narrow and sloping gently downward. Its walls were rough but steady, shaped by tools, not by nature. Water trickled somewhere far off, and the air had the stillness of a place that had been sealed for years. He followed the passage for several minutes until the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. The sight stopped him in his tracks. The space was immense, hollowed directly into the granite heart of the island, its ceiling arched high above, glistening with moisture that caught the lamp light like stars. And there, resting on a platform of stone and shadow, was a ship. The vessel sat in a pool of calm water that connected to the sea through a low archway on the far side. Its hull gleamed faintly beneath layers of dust and salt. The name was still visible on the bow and faded paint. Margaret, too. For a long time, Peter could only stare, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible sight before him with what he knew of the world. The Margaret, too, had been legend in Grey Haven, the ship that vanished without a trace during a storm 20 years ago. And here it was, hidden under his feet all along, preserved like an artifact in the belly of the rock. He stepped closer, his boots echoing softly against the damp floor. The air was still and heavy. He could hear the faint lapping of water against the hull and the distant sigh of the tide through the cave's mouth. He reached out and touched the side of the ship. The metal was cold but intact, its surface smooth beneath a film of salt. The craftsmanship was unmistakable, strong, functional, built for long voyages. A narrow gangplank connected the platform to the deck. He climbed it cautiously, his lantern swaying in the darkness. The ship was eerily silent. Everything was as if frozen in time. Coiled ropes, stacked nets, a compass still fixed to the navigation table, its needle trembling faintly. The cabin door creaked open at his touch, revealing a small, tidy space with a bunk, a chart table, and a shelf lined with books and sealed jars. On the wall hung a faded map of the Maine coastline with marks drawn in pencil. In the corner stood a wooden crate stamped with the words Norcrest Maritime Company. He remembered the stories about that company, the lawsuits, the bankruptcy, the whispered accusations of smuggling and insurance fraud. He pried open the crate. Inside were sealed metal containers wrapped in canvas and wax paper. Tools and instruments lay among them, all neatly arranged. Nothing about the scene suggested panic or shipwreck. This was not the wreck of a vessel lost to the sea. It was a ship deliberately hidden. He found the captain's log on the table. The cover was cracked, but the pages were dry. He turned them carefully, reading by the wavering light. The entries were concise, written in a steady hand. The last dated line read, "Storm approaching, crew sent to shore, vessel secured beneath the rock, cargo safe." Below that, a single phrase had been scrolled in smaller letters, almost an afterthought. "The sea takes what it owns. I will stay to guard it." Peter closed the book and leaned back, the weight of the discovery settling over him. the truth unfolded in fragments. Arthur Hayden had not died in some lonely exile. He had chosen to remain to protect something that others would have stolen or destroyed. He had saved the Margaret too and hidden it here, sealing his secret beneath stone and tide. The lantern's flame flickered, reflecting in the dark water. Peter felt a strange mixture of awe and sorrow. This place was a tomb and a shrine, the final testament of a man who had defied the sea and the world's greed. He walked the deck once more, touching the rail, the wheel, the ropes stiff with salt. He imagined his uncle working here alone for years, repairing the ship, tending to it as though it were alive. The silence around him felt sacred. After a long while, he descended back into the chamber. The tide had begun to rise, and faint ripples licked the edges of the stone platform. He followed the tunnel upward, his footsteps echoing behind him. When he reached the ladder, he paused, looking up toward the faint square of daylight above. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar yet comforting, a sense of purpose. Emerging into the shed, he pulled the hatch closed and secured it with the chain, not out of fear, but of respect. Outside, the sea stretched bright and endless. He stood for a long time, breathing the cold air, letting the wind dry the sweat on his forehead. The island no longer seemed barren. Beneath its hard skin, it held a story no one else had known, a secret preserved by silence and salt. He returned to the house, poured a cup of tea, and sat by the window. His thoughts were slow like the turning tide. The noise of the mainland felt far away, almost imaginary. Down below, in the dark heart of the rock, an entire chapter of history slept, unseen by the world. He wondered what the others would say if they knew. The laughter in Grey Haven would stop, of course, but that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that he finally understood why his uncle had lived and died here. As the light began to fade, he opened the captain's log again and reread the last words. They were not written by a desperate man, but by one who had found peace in his solitude. The sea takes what it owns, but sometimes it gives back more than it ever took. When night came, Peter lit the lantern again and placed it on the windowsill. Its reflection glimmered faintly on the water below. He thought of the ship resting in the hidden cove of the tide, creeping in and out, guarding its secret. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the men who had mocked him were hauling in empty nets, unaware that the man they had called a fool was now the keeper of something far greater than gold. The wind rose gently, brushing against the walls like a whisper, and the house settled into its quiet rhythm again. Beneath it, the sea moved through its slow, eternal cycle, sealing the entrance to the hidden cave, as if to keep its promise. What is given to the sea will remain in the sea until it chooses to tell its story. The morning after the discovery dawned clear and sharp, with sunlight glittering on the wet rocks like scattered coins. Peter stood outside the house, staring at the horizon, his mind still heavy with what he had seen beneath the island. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the ship again, the silent perfection of it, the way it lay preserved in that hidden chamber, like something kept safe by the very bones of the earth. The idea of keeping such a thing secret felt impossible. It was too large, too meaningful, too much a part of history. Yet the thought of exposing it to the world brought an ache to his chest, as if he would be betraying the man who had spent his life protecting it. He knew, however, that sooner or later he had to tell someone. The truth had a weight, and it grew heavier with every passing hour. By mid-morning he had made up his mind. He took his camera, an old weather-beaten thing he used to photograph his catches, and returned to the shed. The chain clattered as he unfastened it. The hatch groaned when he lifted it open, descending into the cold dark. Again, he felt both dread and reverence. The lantern light flickered along the tunnel walls like the reflection of water. When he stepped into the great chamber, the air was as still as before. The tide was low. The ship's hull rose out of the water, massive and silent. He walked slowly around it, photographing every detail. The name on the bow, the equipment, the crates bearing the Norcrest stamp, and finally the captain's log opened on the table, its pages bearing the final entry. The camera's shutter click sounded unnaturally loud, breaking the sacred stillness of the place. By the time he climbed back to the surface, the sun had begun its slow descent. He packed his things carefully and loaded the photographs and the journal into a waterproof bag. Then he started the boat, the Maran, and turned its bow toward the distant coast. The water was calm and cold, reflecting the pale sky. The journey back took longer than before, though he pushed the engine hard. As Grey Haven came into view, the familiar outline of the pier and the clustered houses looked almost unreal after the stark simplicity of the island. When he stepped onto the dock, a few men looked up from their work, surprised to see him. He had told no one how long he'd be gone, and some must have assumed the sea had finally taken him. Back already? Someone called half in jest. Peter gave a short nod and walked past without answering. He went straight to the harbor office, a narrow building that smelled of oil and paper. There he asked to see the local inspector of the Coast Guard. The clerk, a tired man in a blue shirt, raised an eyebrow. About what? He asked. A ship, Peter replied. A lost one. An hour later, he found himself sitting in a small office with two officers, explaining what he had found. Their faces shifted from mild irritation to cautious interest as he spoke. When he handed over the photographs, they leaned closer. One of them whistled softly. That's the Margaret too, he said. It can't be. The other looked at Peter skeptically. You're telling us that ship's been under your island all these years? Peter nodded. It's not mine, he said quietly. It was my uncle's. He built the house there. The officers exchanged a look. By the time he finished describing the hidden chamber, they were convinced enough to act. 2 days later, a Coast Guard cutter arrived at Grey Haven carrying an engineer, a company representative, and a government official. Peter guided them to the island through a choppy sea under gray skies. The closer they drew, the quieter everyone became, as if instinctively sensing that they were approaching something solemn. When they saw the rock rise from the waves, one of the men muttered that it looked like the last place on Earth anyone would hide a ship. The inspection took hours. They documented everything just as Peter had. When they reached the hidden chamber and saw the Margaret II with their own eyes, the silence was complete. The engineer ran his hand over the hull and shook his head in disbelief. It's sound, he said. All this time, and it's barely corroded. The company representative, a pale man with nervous hands, kept repeating the words Norcrest Maritime under his breath as if afraid to speak too loudly. They opened a few of the sealed crates. Inside were tools, measuring devices, and blueprints, all perfectly preserved. In one box, they found the captain's original charter bearing Arthur Hayden's signature. The legal implications were immediate and complicated. The government official said the find would have to be reported to the Maritime Registry. The ownership of the ship, he added, was technically uncertain. But when Peter produced the will that granted him the island, complete with the words and all structures upon it, the official's tone shifted. It would take time, he said, but the law was on Peter's side. Back in Grey Haven, the news spread faster than he could have imagined. Within a day, everyone knew. Men who had laughed at him lined up to shake his hand. The local paper sent a reporter who asked endless questions, his notebook trembling with excitement. By the following morning, the headline read, Fisherman finds lost vessel hidden beneath the sea. The story grew with each retelling. Some said he had found treasure. Others that the ship had belonged to smugglers. The truth was enough without embellishment, but no one in Grey Haven ever let facts get in the way of wonder. Peter endured the attention with quiet patience. The attention was strange, almost disorienting. For years, he had been invisible, a figure moving silently between sea and shore, noticed only when mocked. Now strangers clapped him on the back and called him captain. The same men who had joked about his rock in the ocean now claimed they had always believed he'd amount to something. He smiled when necessary, said little, and returned each evening to the harbor where the noise of the tavern couldn't reach. When the first official report was published confirming the discovery and verifying the ship's identity, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't pride exactly. It was a kind of quiet justice. The Margaret II was no longer a ghost, and neither was Arthur Hayden. The old man's name appeared in the papers again, not as a mad hermit or a failed captain, but as a man who had performed a miracle of preservation. The town that had mocked him now spoke of him with reverence. A week later, the representative of the insurance company arrived from Portland. He was polite, cautious, and visibly out of his depth. Over coffee in the harbor cafe, he explained that the company, long since restructured, would honor the historical claim. A settlement was due significant but not vast. Peter listened quietly. When the man offered to buy the island and the ship for preservation and study, Peter shook his head. No, he said. It stays where it is. The man frowned. It could be worth millions. Maybe, Peter said, but it already cost one man his life. That's enough. The settlement came through a month later. The amount was more money than Peter had ever seen, but not enough to change him. He paid off his debts, repaired the Maran, and replaced the roof of his small house in town. The rest he left untouched in the bank. He kept the island as it was, untouched except for the path he had cleared to the shed. Occasionally, a government boat came by to conduct surveys, but he refused to let anyone stay long. The cave remained sealed, except for rare inspections. Sometimes late at night, he would sit by the window of the house on the island and listen to the surf. He would think about Arthur and the years the old man had spent alone there, guarding his secret. He would think about the men back in town who measured worth in money and talk, and how silence could be a far greater treasure. One evening, as the tide rolled in beneath the cliffs, Peter found the courage to open the captain's log again. He read it slowly, tracing each line as though reading a prayer. The entries were simple: weather, currents, repairs, but in their quiet precision, he felt the echo of a life dedicated to duty. At the end of the last page, below the final entry, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A faint pencil sketch, small and rough, of a house perched on a rock with a figure standing beside it, watching the horizon. Beneath it, one line of writing: "The watch continues." He closed the book carefully and sat back, the lantern light flickering across the pages. Outside, the sea murmured against the stone, steady and patient. For the first time in years, he felt completely at home. Not because he owned land or money, but because he finally understood the inheritance he had been given. It wasn't the island or the ship. It was the silence itself. The same silence his uncle had kept, the kind that asked for nothing but truth. When he returned to Grey Haven the next morning, the men at the dock greeted him with nods instead of laughter. Their words were simple, stripped of mockery. The town, small and rough as it was, had changed in its own way. But Peter didn't linger. He bought supplies, filled the fuel tank, and returned to the island before sunset. He preferred the quiet rhythm of the waves to the noise of admiration. That night, as he climbed the path back to the house, he looked up at the sky. The stars were bright, sharp against the dark. The tide was rising again, covering the entrance to the cave, sealing the secret within. The world could talk and speculate all it wanted. The sea would keep its truth, and so would he. When he finally went inside, the house was warm from the fire he had left burning in the stove. He sat by the window with a mug of tea, watching the faint glimmer of moonlight on the water. Somewhere deep below, the Margaret too rested in her hidden berth, the sound of the tide rocking her gently to sleep. Peter listened until his eyes grew heavy. The laughter of Grey Haven was a distant memory now, as unreachable as the stars. The sea had given him its verdict, and it was final. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Peter had ever known. His name filled the newspapers. His story rippled across the coast, and his quiet life became a spectacle that seemed to belong to someone else. Grey Haven, the town that had once mocked him for every failure, now couldn't stop talking about him. The docks where he used to work alone were suddenly crowded with strangers, their eyes full of curiosity and hunger for a glimpse of the man who had found the ghost ship. Some wanted interviews, others sought photographs, and a few came just to touch his boat as if it carried luck. At first, Peter endured it with the same stoic calm that had carried him through storms. He answered the questions with simple truth and left when the noise became too much. But the more he tried to disappear back into his routine, the harder it became. The world had decided to make him a symbol of something he never asked for. One morning, a crew from a television station arrived unannounced. They brought bright lights, cables, and microphones, setting up on the very dock where the fishermen mended their nets. The host, a woman in a red coat and rehearsed smile, asked him to stand in front of his boat and describe how it felt to become a legend overnight. He stared at her for a long moment, the question echoing absurdly in his head. Then he simply said, "It doesn't feel like anything. I just found what another man left behind." The answer didn't fit her script. She tried again, pressing for drama, for emotion, for some grand revelation. Peter said nothing more. The silence stretched long enough that the crew began packing up, muttering about wasted time. That evening, he returned to the island. The sky was bruised purple, the waves low and slow. The moment he stepped onto the rocky shore, The noise of the world seemed to dissolve behind him. He carried supplies up the path to the house and stopped halfway to look back. From there, the mainland was a faint blue shadow on the horizon. He realized how small it looked, how distant all that noise really was. The house welcomed him like an old friend. The familiar smell of wood smoke and salt wrapped around him as he lit the lantern and set it by the window. The sea below was calm, the tide creeping in to hide the entrance to the cave once more. He poured a cup of tea and opened the window to let the sound of the surf fill the room. It was the only music he trusted. The next day brought a letter from the government. They wanted to declare the island a protected maritime site to preserve the Margaret II as part of the region's heritage. They offered money, a formal title, even a plaque with his name. Peter read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and set it aside. The island did not belong to him in the way they imagined. It had never belonged to anyone. It was a place of silence, and silence could not be owned. When the officials arrived a week later, he greeted them politely but firmly. They explained their proposal again, using long, careful words about preservation and history. Peter listened without interrupting. When they were done, he said, quietly, "You can put your plaques and your papers wherever you like, but the ship stays here in the dark where it was meant to rest." They tried to argue to appeal to his sense of duty or pride, but he shook his head. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about him." He didn't have to say the name. They all knew whom he meant. In the end, they relented. The report they filed said that the island's owner had agreed to limited access under his supervision. They would send researchers once or twice a year. The rest of the time, it would remain untouched. Peter signed the papers without reading the fine print, knowing that as long as he lived, no one would take more than he allowed. Word spread quickly again, but this time the story was different. The newspapers called him the guardian of the rock. Some admired his integrity, others called him a fool for refusing wealth. In Grey Haven, opinions shifted with the wind. Yet even those who scoffed spoke of him with a kind of reluctant respect. It was hard to laugh at a man who had stood his ground against the tide of greed and won. On a gray afternoon, he walked into the town's small market for supplies. The same men who once sneered at him now greeted him with nods. A few tried to make small talk, fumbling for words. One of them, a fisherman with a weather-beaten face, finally said, "Guess we were wrong about you, Pete." Peter looked at him and smiled faintly. "You weren't wrong," he said. "You just didn't know the whole story." After that day, the laughter stopped. The jokes dried up. When he walked the docks, people stepped aside, not out of fear, but out of quiet acknowledgement. They knew what he had done, and perhaps more importantly, what he hadn't done. He had not sold his discovery, not turned it into spectacle or profit. He had simply guarded it as his uncle had before him. Months passed. The sea changed color with the seasons: green in spring, deep blue in summer, slate gray in autumn. The storms returned, and with them the sound Peter loved most, the low thunder of waves striking the cliffs. He spent more time on the island now than on the mainland. The house had become his world, and the rhythm of the tides his clock. Occasionally, a tourist boat would pass in the distance, its passengers pointing cameras at the rock, unaware that the man inside the little house was the same one whose story had filled their news feeds. He preferred it that way. One winter morning, a letter arrived from a maritime museum offering a fortune for the ship and the rights to his story. The envelope was thick, the paper expensive. Peter read the first paragraph and stopped. He carried it outside, lit a match, and watched the flames consume it. The ashes scattered quickly in the wind, vanishing over the cliff. He turned back to the house, the faint smell of smoke mixing with the salt air. The next day, he rowed out to the cove where the hidden entrance to the cave lay beneath the water. The tide was low, and he could see the faint outline of the archway below the surface. He dropped anchor and sat there for a long time, staring down at the rippling reflection of his own face. Somewhere beneath that surface lay the Margaret II, motionless, eternal. He imagined Arthur Hayden sitting there years ago, doing the same thing, watching the water, listening to the voice of the sea. As he sat there, he realized that his uncle had never been hiding from the world. He had simply chosen where to stand. The old man had understood something most people never would. That peace isn't found by escaping noise, but by learning to live without needing to answer it. That evening, as he returned to the house, the horizon was painted in red and gold. The world was quiet except for the slow pulse of waves against stone. He climbed the steps to the house and paused at the door. Looking back one last time toward the mainland, the faint outline of Grey Haven shimmered in the distance. He thought of the years he had spent there, of the laughter, the pity, the endless small humiliations that had filled his days. They felt like the remnants of a life that belonged to someone else. Inside, he lit the fire, set the kettle on, and sat down by the window. The sea outside had turned dark, the tide rising fast. The lantern's light cast warm circles on the walls, and for a moment he imagined his uncle sitting across from him, nodding quietly in approval. They had both been keepers of the same truth, separated by years, but bound by silence. When the kettle whistled, Peter poured the tea and leaned back in his chair. The house creaked softly in the wind. He could hear the deep groan of the sea beneath, shifting through the hidden passages under the rock. It no longer sounded ominous. It sounded alive. The next morning when he went outside, the sky was clear and blue, the kind of morning sailors called honest weather. He looked toward the horizon and smiled. The island, once a joke, had become something greater, a reminder that what others mock today, they may one day kneel to understand. The laughter of Grey Haven had faded, leaving only silence. And in that silence, Peter Hayden had finally found peace. Spring came slowly to the coast, carried on soft winds and restless seas. The ice that had rimed the harbor all winter melted away, and the gulls returned to their constant watch over the water. On calm days, when the mist lifted, people in Grey Haven could see the outline of the island on the horizon, a dark tooth of stone against the pale blue sky. They would point it out to visitors, telling the story of the fisherman who had found a lost ship hidden beneath the rock. Some told it as a tale of luck, others of fate. But the man at the center of it no longer cared how they remembered him. For Peter Hayden, the island was no longer a legend or an inheritance. It was simply home. Each morning he rose before the sun the same way he had as a fisherman. The sea had its own discipline, and he had never forgotten it. He would walk down to the cove where his small boat rested, check the lines, and take it out to fish the shallow waters nearby. The routine grounded him, though he needed the catch less now than before. What he truly sought was not food, but rhythm, a way to measure the passing of days by the sound of the tide and the pull of the current. After his work, he would sit by the cliffs with his notebook, recording the wind, the waves, and the subtle changes in the sea's color. It was a habit he had inherited from his uncle without realizing it. The quiet discipline of observation. Sometimes when the weather was still, he would hear faint echoes from beneath the island, the slow shifting of the water in the hidden chamber, the hollow, steady sound of the ocean's breath. He never went down there anymore. The hatch remained sealed under the old chain. The padlock rusted shut. The ship below no longer needed to be guarded. Its secret had become part of the stone itself. On rare occasions, a government vessel or a research boat would appear on the horizon. They would circle the island cautiously, their radios crackling with polite requests to anchor and inspect. Peter would meet them on the shore, standing with his hands in his pockets, his expression calm but unyielding. Most of the time they would leave without argument, sensing the futility of pressing him. Once or twice he allowed them to take photographs, but never to enter the chamber. "It's not a museum," he would tell them. "It's a grave." They never argued after that. Life settled into a quiet pattern. The town stopped talking about him, or rather, it talked less. The excitement faded as newer stories replaced his in the local gossip. That suited him fine. When he did go to shore, people treated him with an odd mix of respect and caution. The laughter that had once followed him had been replaced by silence, an unspoken understanding that the man who lived on the rock had earned something sacred in his solitude. One summer evening, as the lights stretched long and golden across the water, Peter sat on the edge of the cliff, watching the sea turn to copper under the setting sun. The air was warm, the wind light below. The water moved gently against the rocks, a constant heartbeat. He thought of his uncle again, not as the ghost who had haunted family stories, but as a man who had seen the world's noise and chosen the sea silence instead. For years, Peter had wondered if the old man had died alone or in peace. Now he knew that solitude and peace were not opposites. They could live side by side, like tide and stone. He had visitors that summer, a pair of historians from the university. They came with notebooks full of questions and small voices that carried on more than curiosity. They wanted to document the sight, to record the story before it slipped from memory. Peter invited them inside for tea. The house was simple: wood, stone, and the smell of salt. The wind hummed softly through the open window as they spoke. The historians asked about Arthur Hayden, about the ship, about the years of isolation. Peter answered what he could, but when they asked to see the chamber, he shook his head. Some stories aren't meant to be reopened, he said quietly. They're meant to be remembered. They seemed to understand. When they left the next morning, they thanked him not for his time, but for his silence. After they were gone, he walked down to the shore. The tide was low, and the rocks were slick with moss and seaweed. He looked down into the shallows where the sunlight reached the hidden archway beneath the island. For a moment, he thought he saw something move below, a flicker of reflected light, or perhaps just his imagination. Either way, it brought a strange peace. He knew the ship was still there, resting undisturbed in its stone cradle, guarded by the tide. The sea had a way of keeping its promises. Autumn came again, and with it the storms. The first one struck in October, rolling in from the north with winds that howled like sirens. Peter secured the shutters and waited inside while the house trembled. The waves slammed against the cliffs, sending spray up to the windows. Through it all, he sat by the fire, calm, listening. The roar outside was not frightening. It was familiar. It was the same wild power that had once taken the Margaret II and then hidden it away. When the storm passed, he stepped outside to find the island washed clean. The air was sharp and bright, and the world smelled of salt and renewal. Years slipped by in that quiet rhythm. The house aged with him, its wood silvering under the sun, its stones streaked with lichen. His hair turned white, his hands rougher. The sea remained the same. Some mornings when the fog was thick and the horizon vanished, he could almost believe that the rest of the world had faded away entirely, leaving only the island, the sea, and the endless turning of the tide. One winter he fell ill, a long, slow weakness that kept him in bed for days. There was no one to tend to him but the sea itself. He drank water, slept, and listened to the waves. In his fevered dreams, he saw his uncle standing by the hidden ship, lantern in hand, the same quiet expression on his face. "The watch continues," Arthur said, just as he had written all those years ago. When Peter woke, the fever had broken. He felt lighter, as if a great weight had shifted from his shoulders. That spring, a fisherman from Greyhaven found Peter's boat drifting near the harbor, empty, but in perfect condition. They sent a small crew to the island. The house was neat, the fire long since cold. On the table lay a single open notebook. The last line written in a firm hand read, "The sea takes what it owns, and I am ready." They buried him on the island beside the house, where the grass grew thick between the stones. The government wanted to move him to the mainland, to a proper cemetery, but the townspeople refused. "He belongs to the sea," one of them said, and the others nodded. Years later, sailors still pointed out the island as they passed. Some said on quiet nights, you could see a lantern burning in the window or hear faint footsteps along the cliffs. Others claimed that during the spring tides, when the sea was lowest, a pale shape could be seen far below the surface, the outline of a ship resting in the dark, and beside it, two figures keeping their silent watch. In Greyhaven, the story of the fisherman who inherited a worthless rock and turned it into a legend became something more than a tale of discovery. It became a parable whispered among those who live by the sea, that sometimes the greatest fortune lies not in what we find, but in what we keep safe, not in what we reveal, but in what we choose to protect. And so the island remained a single tooth of stone against the endless blue, a place where laughter had turned to silence and silence to peace. The sea moved forever around it, eternal and patient, carrying the secret of the Margaret II in its depths. And somewhere in that rhythm, as the waves rose and fell, the watch continued, unbroken, as it always had, as it always would. If this story moved you, don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe so you don't miss our next tale of courage and silence at sea. Click on one of the videos now appearing on your screen to keep watching more unforgettable stories. And if you know someone who'd love this one, share it. Let them discover what the sea keeps hidden.